Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast for the 7th through 13th of December. Remember to email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. As noted last week, I'm not going to take questions this week. I wanted to cover a topic briefly that you may have heard about a bit in the news because it is of importance to duck hunters in the Mississippi and Atlantic Flyway. This is the concept of a warm Arctic and cold continents, or the idea that as the Arctic warms in the winter, we actually get colder air mass over the continents. And this seems counterintuitive, but I'm going to tell you how this works. It really, and I'm going to do it in lay terms. There's a lot more to movement of air in the atmosphere that I'm going to cover. But I think this summarizes it well enough for us to understand. One of the things we know is happening is that Arctic ice cover is declining, and this is relative, throughout winter in general, it's declining. We see more sea ice loss during the summer, and we see less sea ice building. The other thing that's happening is the age of the sea ice isn't as old, so we have greater capacity to break down ice in the summer because it's a thinner ice. And then we also have a more difficult time building ice in the fall and winter. So on the left is the decline in the extent in square kilometers, but what that doesn't tell you is the thickness of the ice, which is also declining. On the right side is the extent with the median ice edge, or about where you would expect the ice edge to be at a certain time of year. And as you can see, we're, again, this year we are well behind schedule regarding sea ice. And I've talked about this before. This really sets up differences in pressure systems because that opening in the sea ice changes low pressure and high pressure systems that influence how wavy the jet stream is around the planet. So the Arctic is really warm. And this is what we're seeing over the past, few decades, is that this is the temperature anomalies, or how different in Celsius during December, January, February are the surface temperatures are relative to the past. And if we can see the Arctic is really warm, and then Europe and Eurasia, a lot of over Russia is cold, and then Eastern North America, which is really what affects the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways. So what's going on, right? The Arctic can be really warm. It creates pressure systems that cause a really wavy jet stream or a polar vortex disruption. So what's happened is that we don't have these large temperature differences between the mid-latitudes and the Arctic and a strong jet stream. Instead, we have more warm air at the poles and a lot of basically movement back and forth in that jet stream of low and high pressure systems, which can enable cold air to move to southern latitudes. And so usually where that happens is over northern Europe and then the East Coast. And we've seen these lately quite a bit, especially in February, March, actually after duck season lots of times. So why does this matter to duck hunters in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways? Here's the point. What most climatologists would tell you is that the expectation would be, given that how much the planet is warming, and we know that we do have warming occurring on the planet, the expectation would be that the continents should actually be warmer very often than they are. So what is being created, though, is because the Arctic is open, is a feedback loop which helps sustain cold during the winter in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway. So this is really good news for duck hunters, right? Here's the problem with that, is that it only has such a threshold, and there is potential in the future that the planet's just so darn warm that this doesn't occur anymore. In fact, I think we've seen that in a few years where we do get winter, but it's late January, February, March where that polar vortex disruption can finally take over. Early October, November, December, even early January, what's going on is that sea temperatures around the tropics are so warm and the planet is so warm, it takes a very long time for this wobbly polar vortex to actually occur. So I have concerns about the future of this being a continued thing. The planet, again, is just getting warmer. And that's not something I think that we can dispute. Right now, the good thing is that we have this warm Arctic cold continents feedback loop, which is at least giving us some cold weather in the near term, and that was still pushing some ducks fairly far south. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. The science on it's pretty interesting if you want to look it up. And please feel free to send me some questions about that. I've talked about that kind of wobbly jet stream and the polar vortex disruption previously, but that's really what's going on that's causing it to a large degree is these anomalies of low sea ice to a large degree in the Arctic that are changing pressure systems. So there's your warm Arctic cold continents discussion for the morning. Here's the weekly snow that I've been showing you now that we have a little bit of snow in 2020 compared to 2019. You can see in 2019 we were pretty cold in the upper Midwest and prairies and over towards the Great Lakes states. In 2020, there's just a skim of snow in the Atlantic Flyway, and right North Dakota all the way to Lake Manitoba doesn't have snow cover right now. This is a big deal for mallards because they can still, as long as they still have rivers, they can fly out and field feed if they need to. So this is one of the things that's really keeping mallards from making big moves farther south at this point. I give you the link here. Again, you can select a 2-week snow cover loop and actually watch how this how snow cover changes and do it. And you can select different years and such. So real neat tool if you give it a try. Okay, so what's going on this week? I do predict some mallard migration in the Mississippi Flyway, especially towards the weekend. There's a really good cool down. I will caution that long-term forecasts seem to be over forecasting cold, and it tends to end up being warmer than what they say it's going to be. I think there's a bit of a hiccup in some of the models right now that aren't picking up something going on with the atmosphere at this point, but all I can do is plug the numbers in for the forecast and go from there. But it looks like the weekend gets pretty cold out towards the Mississippi Flyway. And even after that, the long-term forecast looks like there's going to be a pretty good dip in temperature in the Dakotas. So look for something more towards the weekend or next week, really there. There's a couple cold days in the Atlantic Flyway early on, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but it gets into the 40-degree range by Thursday as far north as the Great Lakes region and Atlantic Flyway, so things are going to slow down there really quickly. It doesn't really get cold enough or snowy enough or anything to really cause a major movement of mallards in the Atlantic Flyway. But weather is cold enough to cause good movements of dabbling ducks other than mallards and black ducks during the coming week in the Mississippi Atlantic Flyway. And we'll look at those charts in a second. There's a lot of blue showing up, so that's a good thing for us. And then there was a nor'easter that kind of swirled off the coast, and the mid-Atlantic coast got very wet. My expectation is that spread birds out a bit for those folks. We'll see those maps at the end here. And then we did get some water, in the Midwest and Great Lakes where it's really, has been dry. But I would say it's still dry. The conditions aren't really good for holding and feeding ducks at those latitudes. So let's have a look at the charts. We get some blue again and this is the first time this blue or a potential decreasing abundance has shown up in Green Bay. And so we hope that we'll get some movement of birds out of that region and further south. And then we get a little shot in Ottawa. I mean, we probably still are holding plenty of birds in Ontario and Quebec and locations further north. From black ducks, we've banded on Long Island, for example. All of our returns on those birds have been like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. So they're all, those black ducks are still pretty far north. So there's a good bunch of birds to still come south. So if you're missing your mallards and black ducks, hopefully they're coming soon, but not a lot of cold really here to show them moving anytime soon. Pintails are on the move, I would say, and continue to trickle down the flyway. We see the 6th and 7th as far south as Washington, D.C. and North Carolina. That's just below the threshold, so I wouldn't expect a huge movement. I was out on Saturday, and we're still seeing pintails in central New York. And as you go over to the Atlantic Flyway, they continue to be on the move in general, and in the coming week. But your real movements, they're a little hard. Your real movements are in the Gadwall, Shoveler, Widgeon, Green-winged Teal range. Again, we see early in the week in the Atlantic Flyway a potential movement of Gadwall. We had a few around central New York, but they seem to be really petering out here pretty quick. But everything in the Atlantic Flyway, even into Memphis, Tennessee, is starting to light up with blue. So this is a good thing for moving birds south. Shoveler is an even stronger effect. Again, I had a friend who picked up a juvie female shoveler in central New York area on the weekend, but that's pretty rare. Most of those birds are completely moved out. But we see blue showing up as far south as North Carolina and into the Memphis, Tennessee range. So this is as blue as this chart's looked for a while. And birds folks are probably more interested in. Again, the threshold for these is -10 or a mean temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. So we see those numbers are just a little colder than that in a lot of places. So, right, I'm thinking green-winged teal and widgeon are trickling into the deep south, and then over South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, hopefully trickling in. I know on the Atlantic coast, the region of Delaware, reports are that widgeon and green-winged teal are pretty stacked up right now. So it's going to take some significant weather. And again, that rain that really hit the mid-Atlantic coast is going to, if that produced a lot of areas for these birds to feed, that may actually hold them there for a while too. So we do get cold. I expect birds are trickling, but it's not a blast of cold where we should see a massive migration. But I do expect some movement this week. So that's a little bit of a silver lining for folks compared to what I've been telling you lots of times here for this year. But it is still, I mean, this December still, the November was extremely mild. We're still not in a place where I feel like we've had one good Arctic blast since that October one in the Dakotas that would cause any real substantial movement. So it's just a trickle of ducks on a weekly basis still. The river gauges, last week's on the right and this week's on the left. Again, that nor'easter kind of spun around the DC range, the Chesapeake Bay area. So there's a lot of water in that region and in North Carolina. That is the capacity to hold a lot of birds. The Mississippi River drainage in general up through the Great Lakes is relatively dry. It sounds like folks, from what I've heard, coastal Texas, Louisiana are doing pretty well. So I think we're getting a lot of overflight right now of any birds that move. There's just not a lot of water in a lot of that part of the world. So where you do have water, maybe folks are doing okay, but it sounds like there's actually been an overflight of birds to the coast. But what happens with that lots of times is once the rains come and those things fill back up, those birds can move back off the coast into some of those regions. But we'll see what the season holds. A La Nina is probably going to hold that dry in that region pretty heavy, unfortunately. So I don't have strong expectations for huge amounts of water there at this point, but we'll just have to wait and see. And hopefully folks do get that water that they need to hold some birds around. So thanks a lot, folks. Pretty short show this week, but remember to email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'm doing these until the end of January. So hopefully we get a turn of cold here soon and get some ducks on the move, to get some exciting stuff to talk about in the future. But please do, if any of this sparks some questions, feel free to send them to me. I'll try to cover them at the beginning of the show. Thanks a lot. Have a great week. Be safe and shoot straight.